Welcome to Lancaster Environment Centre and Lancaster University for this session of our online seminar programme. I'm Dr Ali Burkitt and I have the pleasure of facilitating the programme here at LEC. Keep an eye on the events page under About Us on our website for updates on future sessions, and look out for announcements on social media under the hashtag LECSeminar. I saw that the home department of today's speaker picked up on one of our tweets earlier, so I've now seen my tweet back in Spanish. So that was interesting. And if you're joining us on YouTube, don't forget to click on our channel's subscribe button and tick the notification bell so that you always know when we've shared a video. Unfortunately, Professor Mariana Ruffino isn't going to be able to join us today as she's on her way back from some exciting fieldwork. So I have the pleasure of introducing today's LEC seminar speaker, Dr. Germán Baldi, who will be presenting to us on the subject of geographical patterns of protected areas in an uneven world. Germán describes himself as originally a biologist, mutated into a geographer, who enjoys finding relationships between the physical, biotic, and cultural worlds. He's worked on different subjects of study, such as the agricultural use of territory, its degradation from different interventions or stresses, and its conservation. His studies usually involve different spatial scales from the local to the global, and temporal levels from current and historical. He includes remote sensing, geographical information systems or GIS, and multivariate methods of analysis. He says he's very fond of making comparisons between distant systems and finding common factors as well as virtuous cases, and not so virtuous cases, of human-nature relationships. He comes from Argentina, where he's a researcher of the National Scientific and Technical Research Council and a professor at the National University of San Luis. He came to Lancaster and LEC last September, so he's been here for the winter. And he came at the invitation of Professor Mariana Ruffino to work with her on her REDEAL project that she collaborates with Professor John Quinton on. Germán will be here until the end of March, and he's very keen to meet with colleagues and share ideas and investigate potential collaborations. So I know he's included his contact details at the end of the presentation for anyone that wants to get in touch. And he says here in the end of my notes, here and in collaboration with many colleagues from the UK and abroad, I'm devoted to setting links between soil, vegetation and socio-economics of Kenyan landscapes in order to understand pasture management approaches and their imprints on ecological, agronomic and economic productivities. So with that, I welcome Dr. Germán to Lancaster and I hand the session over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ali, for your presentation. I have to share my screen. This is very difficult. And now you can see all.
We can see the slide, not all the notes.
Okay, that's cool. Well, thank you again for the presentation. I'm feeling a bit embarrassed about it, and thank you everyone by attending this seminar. And Mariana that is in Kenya now, for inviting me to Lancaster and LEC during winter. I will never forget winter. Well, Ali mentioned the title. I will show you some results of research that I'm conducting in Argentina, not related with the things I'm doing now here in Lancaster. We will talk about, or I will talk about protected areas, not because of their value of about their to protect or ensure the persistence of biodiversity, but other social and political drivers of them. So let me see. First, I would like to show how Wikipedia, that is a free content, multilingual encyclopedia written by many people, describe protected areas. Protected areas are those locations which receive protection, it's a bit reiterative, the description, because of a recognized natural or cultural value. And below that description, it states that protected areas are implemented for biodiversity conservation, as it was the only driver of their deployment. And what we can see today, I have here a map. Let me show you a map of current distribution or spatial structure of protected areas. What we can see today could be different under other social or economical conditions. The 270,000 units that covers like approximately 16% of the land and 8% of the earth could be deployed differently. So what I tried to understand was how this current protected structure that arose from an interplay, very complex interplay of motivations, how the extent of this current distribution fit alternative motivations of protected area deployment. So which are the motivations? Which are the motivations of deployment? Well, Wikipedia stated that was biodiversity conservation, but that's a very recent motivation of deployment. Originally, most protected areas were deployed to preserve some spiritual, religious, I know how to say, cultural values of that landscape. Landscape that were remarkable in terms of sceneries, in terms of their aesthetic, were set aside by a small group of promoters, and most of the promoters could be like political, could be labeled as political elites. Imagine previous to what we know about Yosemite or Yellowstone, there were also protected areas like the sacred groves in India that were deployed by people that want to manage or to control the natural resources on those areas. Later, perhaps, or at the same time, many protected areas were deployed because their high values in terms of animal populations. And we know that there were several protected areas in the Indian subcontinent or in Europe set aside or deployed to ensure elites to have game. We can think about those reserves in India in where tigers were hunted, or in the UK or the British Isles, where elites hunted foxes, for example. With later in time, or with the arise of new countries like those of America or Africa or Southeast Asia, there were many protected areas deployed to ensure frontier protection, or to shape a national identity. Moreover, in America, where there was no an identity of all the newcomers to those new countries like Argentina. So in Argentina, there's like there was and there is like a propaganda in where we have from glaciers to rainforests, and those glaciers and rainforests are part of our identity. And in Argentina and many other places in the world, protected areas were used as an appropriation of those conflictive or geopolitical hotspots occupied with a force that are protected area rangers. Later, with a general increasing well-being, global well-being, many protected areas were promoted to attract tourists, and so we can label that group of motivations are touristic, recreational, or leisure ones. In the middle of, or since the middle of the 20th century, or from the 1970s, the idea of protected areas as tools for protecting biodiversity or protecting geological diversity arise. So this idea of the essence of protected area as places where nature is protected by a per se value, by its percent value, is really new. Here we have an emu and the protection, two motivations, two biocentric motivation. One that intends to protect biodiversity in terms of richness and dimensions, and one that seeks for a representation of abiotic or or in this case, a vegetational representation within a protected area network. At the same time, it's not really new, but the label is new. A motivation for the deployment of protected areas is the assurement of the provision of ecosystem services. We can see here a bee and a clear sky. So protected areas are like lungs of the planet. And not so promoted, but usually known as a motivation is that those areas that are feasible to become part of a national protected area system are those that are far, cheap, and with a lack of resources. So those isolated areas. So what I did to try to link these motivations and the current extent of protected areas it's a very simple GIS exercise, gridding the territory, and on each grid calculate a geographical trait and a fraction of protection. And then I have along this geographical trait that could be biophysical or could be cultural, calculate the protected area, the protected fraction. And as a result slash bar conclusion, look how isolated areas are highly protected, and areas close to population from this metric are very lowly protected. I don't know how it's said. And we can see a very marked relationship between isolation as a measure of opportunity and protection. Look how tourism attractiveness also seems to be related as a driver or as a consequence to the fraction of protected areas. Those areas with more photos per inhabitant as a measurement of beauty of the beauty of the landscape are more protected than those areas that are not so beauty. And this is animal richness, and you can see that very poor areas in terms of animal richness, I also have this for vascular plants, etc., are the most protected ones, and then the relationship drops with some noise here. So with random forest analysis to understand the importance of the variable, I can see that isolation, well, you cannot see here, isolation or population are very important variables, while animal richness, it's a bit important, but all the way around, not because when animal richness increase, protected area increase, but in the contrary. So, opportunism seems to be what drove or drives protected areas extent globally. And I have this analysis for the globe, for some regions, and for South American countries. You can see here distance to frontiers as a motivation of frontier protection, how in the first hundreds of kilometers, there's some decayment at the global level. At the regional level for Southeast Asia as well as for other regions, you can see also how closer to protected area, to frontiers, the higher the level of protection. And this is very marked in some countries like Argentina. If you see a map of Argentinian protected areas, they are almost all on the borders with Chile and at the lower extent with Bolivia and Brazil. So this gives us an idea how non-biocentric motivations drive or drove the preservation of nature, very far from what Wikipedia says. And let's do a pause, and I will show you now a second part of results. We have several motivations, and we have a social, political, or moral filter, coffee filter. And from that filter, out of that filter, anything can come out. So protection is driven primary by motivations filtered by other variables. And I will show you in the next two sections how agendas or economical or financial availability filter those motivations. As far as I knew when I ran this exercise, there were very few papers dealing with these relationships. And those papers mostly say that the level of protection depended on these values, post-materialism, economic prosperity, governance, etc., and in where these values were high, conservation was higher. And obviously, the global north achieved, or the hypothesis was that the global north, more developed with more higher post-materialist values, have more protected areas than the global south, to say it in a broad way. Most of these five papers, or none of these five papers, explored a very evident trait that is the size of the country. And the size of the countries in a geographical sense and in other senses like gross domestic product, etc. And most of these papers, I think all of these papers, ignored most developed countries like all in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, the US, and also ignored very small countries like the one that were here, option pen, like the one in here. So ignoring those extreme cases of development or isolation really constrain what we can learn about extreme cases or deviant cases. So in this second part, I will show you, as well as common variables like democracy or governance, other variables driving protected extent like land size, military expenditure, or having or not external possessions. At a first cartographic glance, you can see how US, the conterminous US, has has a very low protected area under categories 1 to 4 of IUCN. While contrasting countries like Liechtenstein or Sao Tome Principe in Africa, Sao Tome, Liechtenstein in Europe, has comparatively larger protected area values, or even Bhutan in the Himalayas has almost 41% of conservation. And these are quite contrasting countries. When I plot all these, most countries, 194, against a land area gradient or military expenditure gradient, you can see that very teeny tiny countries can't have protected areas. This is a logarithmic scale. When the area rises, countries start having a lot of protected areas. There's a large variability, as you can see. And when we go to the right end of the gradient, up to US, Russia, China, or Argentina, you can see that the curves descend. And this is a quite marked pattern according to random forest analysis. When I plot military expenditure, that at the beginning we cannot imagine a relationship with the protected area, this model is stronger. Those very powerful countries have less protected areas in terms of fraction of the country than those very quiet or non-militarized countries. The variables in this univariate analysis that are meant to determine protected extent don't show any clear relationship like income inequality. And these two plots can imply a very strong, I can say something very strong about, with these two plots, that if countries like the Russian Federation, US, Argentina, China, etc., would copy the models of very tiny countries like Liechtenstein, Niue, or Bhutan, the extent of the state of protected areas at the global level would rise substantially. If Russia would copy Liechtenstein, it would include 1.4 million kilometers and the global protected area extent. And well, which are the ideas that came out trying to explain this relationship? This is the first idea. Countries that has low taxpayers, a low number of taxpayers, let me say it again, in countries with a low population, having a public good or service would cost per capita more than in a country where there are a lot of taxpayers. So we would expect, oh no, this is not the, we would expect this kind of relationship. This is protection, this is country size, and we would expect that larger countries would have more protected areas. But this didn't happen. The next idea or a posteriori hypothesis would be that smaller countries needs to be integrated to the world because of their lack of resources and their small economical size. So they try to accomplish international agreements or international or global social movements like preserving biodiversity. And this happens in smaller countries. This happened because, as shown with my graphics, smaller countries had more protected extent, a higher protected extent. This idea could also be related to an exertion of soft power. Countries with bigger countries, larger countries, more powerful countries can set the agenda, but don't accomplish. But smaller ones have to. And this could be understood as a green grabbing concept. The next idea of hypothesis is that larger countries have larger resources, mostly, and have some redundance of those resources. But smaller countries don't. They have to preserve their nature to accomplish representation motivations like the one of Aichi of 17% of conservation in 2020, and they cannot end their resources. They have to preserve their resources in order to continue existing. And this also is related to the this could be also related to the idea that these small countries goes for economic activities that are not consumptive, like tourism. More, if we consider that most small countries are islands. And a last idea or hypothesis is that these small countries or areas, perhaps in these countries, population is more aware about preservation because they have to be self-sufficient, and they can see degradation and they can see scarcity, so they could be more engaged to conservation because of this. So in the third and last part of my presentation, I will show what happens in the oceans, because everything I told you about was in the land, in the continents. What happens in the ocean? That is the majority of the Earth. Well, there are countries in the ocean, and countries has, as it's evident, obvious, a strong interest in them. And since 1992, broadly, there are 200 nautical miles that belongs to countries that are these exclusive economic zones. I'm trying to see my pointer. Yeah, these exclusive economic zones. So in this ocean, there are a lot of countries, and in the Pacific and in most oceans, there are a lot of countries probably unknown and a lot of interests. So I conducted the same analysis, but plotting protected extent against the exclusive economic zone size. And what I found is that the pattern of size versus protected area, a protected extent, or military expenditure versus protected extent was exactly opposite that the one found in lands. Smaller countries have less protected areas. Larger countries have more protected areas in the ocean. The same to military expenditure. More power superpowers have most of their oceans protected, while small countries don't, with the exception of two oceanic countries like the Cook Island is not completely independent, it's part of the New Zealand Commonwealth, and the Palau. That is also, well, it's independent, but with some arrangement with the US. And if we consider that there's a metropolis or there's a central territory, let me show, there's a central territory, and there is a periphery. This is Chilean EEZ, and this is San Ambrosio and San Alfonso, also from San Felix and San Ambrosio, also from Chile, and the Easter Island, also from Chile. We can see that in the central territories, the protection tends to be smaller in comparison with peripheral territories, those that are undisputed or those that are contested by two or more countries. And this behavior or this result is a rather conservative one because, well, I will show you. It's a rather conservative one because I considered only as periphery those areas detached from the mainland. But in Argentina, this is Argentina, I'm from here, we have also our protected areas in very far regions, far from the capital or main cities. This could be considered as an opportunistic approach, an opportunism given by the distant to metropolis or big cities or productive areas, given by the population and infrastructure and current economic importance. And if you plot the EEC areas with the protected areas for Argentina, you can see that we have this in here in a hotspot of conflict with Chile, and this here in a hotspot of conflict with the UK. This is a Falkland Island EEZ, and this is Chilean protected area, EEZ area. And both Chile, Argentina, and UK have most of their EEZ areas protected. Let's not talk about what happens in Antarctica with more and more countries involved in this preservation. So, beyond opportunism, beyond biocentrical motivations driving conservation, we have geopolitics. Geopolitics that could be understood as, or we can split the idea of geopolitics in four fingers. One is that if a country preserves a periphery, would have a metropolitan support of metropolitan citizenship support. People like to see more red or green areas in their maps. It's not only a periphery or a disputed area, it's a protected area that we have to safeguard. We can see, or we can hypothesize that if a land becomes protected, there's a reconfiguration of the metropolis periphery relationship in terms if the periphery has a population. So this can deprive some citizen rights, and instead some authors said that it's a way to ensure colonialism or like an aggressive, not aggressive, well, to ensure like sovereignty over the territory. We can hypothesize that it's a way of assuring future goods. If a very far area is protected, nobody can enter that area now, but who knows in the future. Or we can say that protected areas could secure future claims on the adjacencies. And there's no new. It's known that many of those protected areas in the peripheries, in Argentina, in Chile, in UK, hold military possessions. This is a very funny cartoon of the first marine protected area in Argentina. Well, here it says marine protected areas are conservation and management tools for ecosystem preservation, etc. This is a very important ONG from Argentina that is part of the WWF. And if you see what the cartoonists draw here, it's very weird because the title of the cartoon is Limits, and there's something blue or white thing that says, there you cross this line. And there's a human here like being threatened. And here the thing has a sign of protected area. For whom this cartoon, why it was mentioned in this way, I don't know. But this was the protected area of Namuncurá Banco Burgat that is in this Argentinian UK hotspot. So, as concluding remarks, opportunistic forces were and will be strong drivers of conservation. We have to take that, we have to acknowledge that. The commitment of nations to conservation is quite uneven, and nations in many threats uneven in terms of GDP or military expenditure, etc. Inlands, those countries that hold more responsibility, like Russia, China, US, Argentina, protect less, while others protect lots. How can they do that, and why we cannot as an Argentinian? In the ocean, it's the other way around. So Argentina has few protected areas, but US has a lot. And I wrote here but because those extremely large protected areas of large and more powerful countries could be subordinated to build or broader national interests, locally, interests of local local level or global level. And this veiled or broader interest could threat the subsistence of nature in those protected areas. And I forgot to write it here, but at the beginning, protected areas in the land also followed geopolitical motivations. And there was an expansion, and now there might be a degradation in terms of area, in terms of quality, etc. In the oceans, again, what begins is or what drives initially are geopolitical motivations, all together with other biocentric motivations, and probably in the future, by this broader and veiled interest, we can also see some degradation or degastment or downgrading of ocean protected areas. And at last, nothing of what I presented here questions the importance of protected areas in the preservation of nature in a very broad sense, and neither the efforts of those people dedicated to strengthening the global conservation network. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I'll be here until April, so if you want to talk or do questions, please, or find me, please do. Thank you, everyone, and Ali.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation there, Germán. Global questions are arising in my head already. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll take them from there. While people are typing away, I will take the chair's prerogative and ask a first question.
Okay.
The protected areas in the UK get discussed a lot because we've got things like all the nature reserves and sites of special scientific interest that have a high level of protection. But our sort of bigger protected areas are things like national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, etc., that have people, lots of people in them. They're not isolated. You know, you're talking a lot about how protected areas around the world, the distance from cities and all those sorts of things. Well, there are towns within our protected areas, which first question, is that unusual in comparison to protected areas elsewhere in the world? I assume it is. And if it is unusual, how did you manage to factor that into your analysis in any way?
It's a very good question, and I was expecting that. I was very shocked by the population density inside protected areas because I went to Lake District and also to the forest of Bowland. And I didn't take care of those mesh of those different or variable conditions, but we are analyzing those conditions in another research. And out in America or in Latin America, that level of modification is completely unusual. When we go to a protected area, it means to going into the wild. And what I told one of my colleagues, one student, it's let's do an analysis of. Please don't copy the idea or share. Let's do an analysis of comparing how many papers explore the intrusion of humans into protected areas in the neotropics. There are many papers showing deforestation, fires inside protected areas, but there are few papers showing how Japanese, European, mainly, protected areas are modified. And that's also an ideological, perhaps not conscient, bias in what we know about protected area geography. Blaming the poor for using natural resources and degrading perhaps some nature, but not watching or not exploring how, at least at the global, I don't know, I don't really know the bibliography of protection in Europe, but at least there are not so many papers showing this contrast. I can recommend one of Kendall Jones that shows human footprint on the world, and he and his colleagues only says this is higher in West Europe, but it's only a mention for what I know. I don't know if I replied.
Yes, you did.
It's
We're
quite
weird.
weird.
Yes, I thought that was
It's
the
quite
answer.
weird to go to the forest of Bowland and not seeing forest.
Yeah. Well,
But
that's a linguistic thing as well,
yeah,
because forest doesn't mean forest in
yeah,
the UK.
but it's really beautiful.
This is true.
Yeah.
For anyone that's watching this talk and doesn't know the Forest of Bowland, it's an area just outside Lancaster that is sort of moorland and quite open. It's not forest in the tree sense of the word. It is a historical royal hunting ground, which is where the word comes from.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions? If you want to, stick your virtual hand up and unmute yourself and ask a question directly, that's also fine. Germán, if you want to stop sharing your screen, you
sure.
see some chat as well.
This is difficult.
I had a big stop presenting button at the top when I ended mine. I don't know what you get. We've got a hand up from Louise Carver if you want to take a question.
Yeah. I'm still sharing?
No, we just can't see you, but it's okay.
Hi, Germán. Thank you so much for
Luis.
the presentation. That was very interesting. It's a kind of question and comment. And I was wondering if you were familiar with, because the irony of all of this is that what you said, this idea of biodiversity or wildlife conservation is a relatively new reason for creating protected areas. And the irony of it is that it's not actually doing a very good job of preventing or reversing the trajectories of biodiversity loss globally, the protected area model. And I was wondering if you were familiar with the new language and frameworks and intentions coming out from the IPBES, the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, talking about the need for transformational change in terms of recognizing that these sort of area-based conservation techniques aren't sufficient at all, because many of the drivers for the decline of nature are indirect and they're actually arising from other places, climate change or pollution or invasive species or these things. And I was wondering if you'd encountered that very much in your research, or if you had any sort of thoughts about the how that might interface now with the ways in which countries, design their protected area frameworks, or if that had featured at all.
Thank you, Luis, for your question. I'm not really familiarized with that new approach. So I'm not familiarized on political. I have never contact with Argentinian protected area system, so I don't know how they might be changing. But you're asking me if I'm sorry, I didn't understand you completely.
It was more that even though biodiversity conservation is now used as a reason to create protected areas, especially under the 30 by 30 frameworks, but you've shown us that actually isn't really the reason to create protected areas. In many instances, they interface with all sorts of other desires and geopolitical reasons, actually. And actually now the conservation sector itself, the IPBES, who are like the IPCC, but for biodiversity conservation, are saying actually, the area-based approach is itself insufficient. They need to be talking about transformational change across the whole sector, which means, addressing subsidies that are driving nature decline, looking at the sort of broader political factors and the things that are driving nature decline outside of the protected area itself. So it seems as if it's hanging in the balance, this idea of the protected area model for nature conservation, because it's not preventing, the current trajectories of decline in nature. But don't worry too much. I wondered if you had just encountered this transformational change language with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that there's a movement to broad the approach to preserve nature, but I wouldn't consider that the mismatch between biodiversity and protected areas it's a failure. It would be just that for each protected area there are several motivations that behind it. So if protected areas if protected areas were meant to, or were deployed to preserve biodiversity, richness, endemisms would be failing, but they are doing other things as well. Well, that's that's what comes to my mind now, and I don't know if if I replied your question, but we can discuss it if you want.
Yeah, I will send you some. I've been doing a little work in this area, so it's nice to hear about your research. I'll send you an email after.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. Are you seeing me pink and freezing?
You are just a black square. I don't think your camera is working.
Okay, let's try it again.
Does anyone else have any questions that they want to ask at this point? There we go.
No.
I think we have sort of run over the official end of the meeting, so I imagine some people are heading off. But it's been a really interesting discussion looking at the differences across different countries. I had no idea, for example, there was so much protected area in Bhutan. Yeah, that was completely new thought to me. But I suppose that there are ideological reasons for that in a country like that.
Religious regions as well. That 40% is only under categories 1 to 4 that are the most strict. If you expand it to categories 1 to 6, it's 60% of the country. And in Argentina, in categories 1 to 4, we have only 2.3%. And our former president made strong announcements of achieving Aichi agreements that is impossible, or it's not real. But we should plan a trip to Sao Tome Principe with to Liechtenstein, but Liechtenstein will be more expensive.
Yes. Yeah, interesting as well, the difference. There's a lot of researchers here in Lancaster that work on coral reefs and coral reef sort of systems. So the marine protected areas is something that they obviously come into contact with quite a lot. So it's very interesting, although in some ways probably not surprising when I think about it, that the relationships between size and shall we say monetary prowess of countries and their protected areas in the sea are very different to on the land. I guess the sea is an area and a resource that you try to hold on to because other people could take it, whereas your land is your land, I guess.
Yeah. It's devoid of people. Sea, not the islands among those EEZ areas.
Well, if we don't have any more particular questions jumping out, I think we'll call it a day. So thank you very much again, Germán, for a really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And yes, welcome to LEC. Sorry, we're not all meeting in person quite as much as we would like, but hopefully you'll get some interesting conversations and collaborations out of today.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you to our audience for joining us and anyone that will be joining the video on YouTube when it goes live. As I say, our events are on our website and we share them on social media, and we will be announcing on there when the video for this is live for people that want to share it with anyone else. So for now, best wishes to everyone from us here at Lancaster Environment Centre, Lancaster University, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.